Unless you've been living under a rock, you have no doubt been hearing about the prolific pedophile and sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein, who just can't help but cause trouble for everybody in government even 6 years after his infamous death. But long before Epstein made that unauthorized phone call 2 hours after lockdown, and that pesky little prison jumper sprouted legs and walked right up to Jeff's cell, he was just a poor little yeeb from Brooklyn. How on earth did he go from an absolute nobody, a college dropout from a working class family, to the child plug of some of the richest people who have ever lived? Well, as every tinfoiled fella on this planet can tell you, there's way too many coincidences in this man's wild and heinous fucking life for there not to be a massive multinational conspiracy at play. Our story begins in the year 1953, when this little fellow was born to Paula and Seymour Epstein, a school worker and Parks and Rec employee respectively. The young Jeff, an overweight piano-playing dweeb, would attend public high school to the age of 16 when he graduated early. Shortly afterwards, he would drop out of college and get a job as a science and math teacher in one of the most prestigious high schools in New York City. How or why remains unclear, but what is clear is that the man who hired him was the formerly Jewish headmaster and prolific zesty science fiction writer Donald Barr. Additionally, Old Don in a past life was also an early member of the OSS, which you may be familiar with in its modern incarnation, the CIA. And obviously, this will not come into play at all later in the story. However, the young Epstein's career in education was short-lived, as multiple students may or may not have reported that he was probably getting up to some less than kosher extracurriculars. Shortly thereafter, he would be terminated due to poor performance. However, through his new pal, Ace Greenberg, the father of one of his students and the CEO of one of the largest financial firms in the country, Bear Stearns, Jeffrey was able to transition into a career as a floor trader at the firm. In 1980, after supposedly committing a Reg D violation, he was let go from Bear Stearns and began his own company, focused around recovering stolen or lost assets from very wealthy clients. For some weird reason, Jeffrey also reportedly told friends that he was an intelligence agent and possessed an Austrian passport that listed his place of residency as Saudi Arabia, a country that Jews couldn't even legally enter at the time. Through his business, he would meet many contacts and eventually become the financial advisor to many of the world's richest people, in the process becoming very rich himself. But that's not all he was doing, as of course he was also using his many properties and wealthy friends to traffic thousands and thousands of young women, often far, far under the age of 18. Now, the exact details of all the horrible shit going down on Lil St. James you have probably heard already. And for my own sake, I don't really want to have to say and read this shit over and over again. So instead, I'm going to shift gears to a much more lighthearted and easy to tackle subject, John Wayne Gacy. Side note, which is not even really that necessary, but if for some fucking insane reason you're seeing this video and haven't watched this one by Flesh Simulator, go watch it right now. It is one of the main sources for this part of the video. Anyway, long story short, John Wayne Gacy had connections not only to local politics, but also to a national pedophile gang that often sold films with people who were no longer alive, through his roommate and employee, Philip Paskey. Now, some people might tell you that perhaps many of the bodies discovered in the tiny crawl space location of less than tiny big boy John Wayne Gacy's house were most likely committed by other members of this organization and not himself, but that's not what this video is about. Paskey was also close associates with a man named John Norman, who was essentially the 1970s Goy version of Jeffrey Epstein. Norman's bread and butter was a mail-order boy service that over decades of operation had accrued thousands of clients by the time of his arrest in 1973. The identities of whom we've never been able to see thanks to the State Department's convenient destruction of Norman's full client list after his arrest, which, according to many different people, included the names of well-known celebrities and wealthy elites. This can somewhat be confirmed as we know of at least one extremely wealthy fella who dabbled in John Norman's company. His name was Frank Shelton. He was a millionaire who descended from generations of Michigan elites and owned a private island in North Michigan called the North Fox Island, which he ran as a summer camp for nefarious purposes. However, following the busting of his operation, he was more or less allowed to walk free, escaping to Holland and later successfully suing his financial manager for most of his money. Prior to his arrest, Michigan appears to have been a sort of child abuse mecca, with many of the big players from down south such as Norman and his clients and associates such as his editor, Berta, would travel up to Michigan's various hotspots, including North Fox. But that wasn't the only large congregation of young children away from parental supervision in the northern Michigan area. Just south lay a small, unincorporated community based around the boarding music camp Interlaken. Until then, we return to Jeffrey, when in 2006, he would be busted for having sex with a child. Alex Acosta, his prosecutor, who would later go on to be Attorney General for Donald Trump, would give him what everyone knows as the sweetheart deal, to the point that when you hear the phrase sweetheart deal, you probably think about this exact deal. Acosta said the reason that he received this deal was because the State Department informed him that Jeffrey was an intelligence asset. There it is. And so our central question remains: how on God's green earth did this absolute nobody become an intelligence agent and renowned pedophile, as you need access to important people to do both at the scale he did? Oh, look at that. There's one part I forgot. In 1967, as a young piano whiz, just 14 years old, Epstein attended Interlaken. It's worth mentioning that this isn't just any music camp, but an extremely prestigious, fancy schmancy type place that lots of talented young rich children attend. Among them was probably Billy Barr himself, who in addition to being the son of the man who would hire Jeffrey to be a teacher with no credentials just 7 years later, would also be the Attorney General at the time of his death and would lead the official inquiry, was just 17 at the time. Additionally, famous and wealthy people made up the faculty and board, such as the famous radio host Carl Hass, who was president of the school at this period. And as you could imagine, they allowed child abuse to flourish. Just this year, Interlaken announced an investigation into allegations of sexual misconduct by instructors towards a number of male victims from the 60s to the 70s, around the same time Old Bill and Jeff were staying there. Though, of course, that's certainly not the full extent of the abuse. We know of at least one victim that was trafficked by Epstein himself later in the 2000s, and another instructor who was fired in 2005 for a sexual offense, although this event remains shrouded in mystery. And not just on-campus freaks roam this crazy part of Michigan, as it's become a sort of hotspot for demons to come and offer alcohol to the students and lure them off campus. A strategy I'm sure is far from new and existed back when another State Department-style pedophile roamed free with his infinite access to heinous material, rich dickheads, and children themselves. And of course, as Jeffrey Epstein began to make his money with his private company, John Norman would be arrested for the final time and spend the rest of his life in prison. A coincidence? I don't know, probably.